Welcome, everyone, to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Professor Nick Giordano. Glad you could be here. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends and on social media. Now, this episode is actually going to be one of the most important that I've done because I have a great guest today. I have the Attorney General of Missouri, Andrew Bailey, is here joining me. And he is one of the people, well, he is the person, single-handedly responsible for exposing the mass censorship apparatus that infects our nation, particularly with the Biden administration and our institutions. So I want to welcome the Attorney General to the show. Attorney General, how are you today?
Hey, thank you so much for having me on and for covering this important issue. Really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter.
Well, I think that this is the issue of 2024. I think that this is an issue of our lifetime because we see a growing government that is routinely abusing its power, trying to determine what people can and cannot say, what they see and what they can see. And the coronavirus really exposed the extent that this apparatus has been built out. So now my first question to you, everyone needs to look at the case Missouri v. Biden, because you decided to take the Biden administration head on. What first got you curious as to something's wrong here, something's going on, and that you needed to get to the bottom of it?
Well, it's all about, like you said, protecting our First Amendment right to free speech. And I think it's important to frame the conversation in terms that everyone can understand. The Constitution exists to protect us from the government, and the government exists to protect our rights. The rights codified in the Bill of Rights come from God, not man, and they enshrine timeless principles. The First Amendment right to free speech, was true in the 1700s with pamphlets, was true in the 1920s with radio, was true in the 1950s with television, was true in the 1990s with internet, and is true in the 2020s with big tech. It doesn't change just because the technology changed. The timeless principle of freedom remains the same. I'm blessed to inherit an office that my predecessor, now Senator Eric Schmitt, initiated this lawsuit in conjunction with Jeff Landry, the Attorney General in Louisiana, and private plaintiffs. We're proud to have partnered with them. It is Missouri v. Biden because we here in Missouri believe in the right to free speech and the protections provided by our Constitution. And when I took office on January 3rd, I was committed to moving this case forward and holding wrongdoers accountable. We've amended the claims to add additional allegations, additional legal support for our theories. We've done preliminary discovery, 20,000 pages of documents, numerous depositions, and have uncovered a relationship of coercion and collusion from the federal government across a spectrum of bureaucratic agencies, coercing and colluding with big tech social media to silence American voices in violation of our right to free speech. What first got me interested in this case was the emails I saw in discovery, where officials at the White House were saying that the censorship demands were coming from the very top levels of the White House, meaning Joe Biden himself, and were targeting specific posts. They said, take down that Tucker Carlson video, take down that Tommy Lahren post, deplatform, de-emphasize, kick off the social media platform, anyone who's questioning the effectiveness of a vaccine or of mask mandates. And clearly that runs afoul of our right to free speech, and I'm going to continue to fight to protect our constitutional rights.
But I'm a little confused because the New Jersey Governor Murphy stated that the Bill of Rights was above his pay grade and that it didn't come into consideration when he was thinking about all his COVID decrees and restrictions. But as Attorney General, you recognize something was fundamentally wrong when you have officials that are bypassing the Bill of Rights. And how many people did you interview for this case? I mean, there was a lot of individuals across the federal government that you interviewed in depositions, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And again, we have only done preliminary discovery to obtain a preliminary injunction. We've only just scratched the surface because you're right. This isn't just an isolated incident of individual posts being removed. This is a vast censorship enterprise that grew so quickly that the federal government had to design a new bureaucratic apparatus to manage the censorship, and it is ongoing. The Department of Justice in open court has committed to future violations. So as we move into an election cycle next year, it is more crucial now than ever to continue to build a wall of separation between tech and state. And shame on any public official in New Jersey or elsewhere who would take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution and then almost in jest ignore the plain text and the legal requirements codified in the document itself.
And it's amazing because I remember one email was from CDC, Carol Crawford, where it talked about with Twitter officials, unapproved opinions, as if the government gets to approve what opinions we can have and which ones we can't. Now, the government says that they have to censor, that they have to engage in these practices to combat misinformation and disinformation. What's wrong with that logic that the government's putting out there?
Well, and it's assault on the legacy of freedom that we've inherited from the founding fathers that's then protected by previous generations of Americans who fought to defend our constitutional rights. The First Amendment is intended to invite dissent. It's supposed to protect a marketplace of ideas where the people can come to what is and isn't truthful based on our own conversations. Government censorship is actually counterproductive because people trust information less if they think they're being silenced, squelched, and muted at the government's demand. It's government censorship has never worked. It's counterproductive. But in this instance, the speech that was censored during COVID all ended up being truthful speech, and it was viewpoint discrimination. They targeted one side. They want to silence any voice in opposition because they can't win the debate on the merits. The remedy for disfavored speech in this country, or untruthful speech in this country, is counter speech, not government censorship. That has been true since the time of our founding, remains true today, despite the lies that President Biden and his Department of Justice are selling.
So you're saying that they're engaging in misinformation and disinformation when they say that. And
dripping with irony. Yeah.
You're in government, and let's be honest, when it comes to the federal apparatus, too many people have forgotten the concept of federalism, that the states play a role in the system. The federal government is not the be-all, end-all in this system. But if we look throughout history, it has been central governments that have been the largest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation throughout history. And we witnessed it with the coronavirus, right? The Wuhan laboratory, the vaccine being perfectly safe, that mass work, and anyone that questioned it, they got silenced and censored. One of the things that you uncovered that I think is extremely startling is that the American taxpayers were actually paying for the censorship. And can you just explain to the audience the relationship with FBI and Twitter and the tax dollars that flowed their way?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, the censorship enterprise began in the FBI and the Department of Justice with the deep state, who were in possession of the Hunter Biden laptop in 2019, knew of its authenticity, knew it was real, and yet set the conditions to be able to censor that story in the fall of 2020. They met with big tech the FBI and Department of Justice met with big tech social media executives in the weeks and months leading up to the election cycle with increased frequency. They met more often the further along they got in that calendar year, and kept telling big tech that there was going to be a Russian disinformation story targeted at Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, and involving a computer that belonged to him. So they knew it was true, and yet convinced big tech that it was going to be a Russian disinformation story. And then there was a secret communication that we have evidence of on the very eve of the New York Post breaking that story that we are certain caused the censorship of that story. Now think about that. That was truthful information that the American voting public deserved to have as they went to the ballot box, and they were deprived of that information by FBI officials at taxpayer expense. But it got worse. President Biden, from the campaign trail, from the Oval Office, from the podium at the White House, and from the White House lawn, has continued to threaten big tech social media with antitrust litigation, lawsuits, and or repeal or amendment of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act if they didn't increase their censorship efforts. And then told them specifically what those censorship efforts should look like. That is, in fact, coercion and collusion, again, at the taxpayer expense. So there are a lot of initiatives, a lot of proposals in Congress right now, including by my predecessor, now Senator Eric Schmidt, to eliminate any financial benefit to a federal official who knowingly violates our First Amendment rights. We shouldn't be paying for people to attack our free speech.
This is one thing that frustrates me more than anything else. The fact is that if I go out and I violate an ordinance or a traffic infraction, I'm going to have to pay a fine or a penalty. If I commit a crime, I'm going to be arrested and prosecuted. Yet there's no, if you violate the Constitution as a government bureaucrat, there's no accountability within the system. You're not punished. You're not fired. You don't have your pension taken away. You don't get arrested. You don't go to jail. Is that the reason that they act with such impunity at this stage, that they know
Absolutely.
that there's very little repercussions?
They're unaccountable to the electorate. There is no room in our constitutional structure with three individual branches of co-equal government for a fourth administrative state that's unaccountable to the electorate, that is consolidated all power, all executive law enforcement of power, all legislative lawmaking power, and all adjudicatory judicial resolution power as well. I mean, that's exactly why the founders created 3 co-equal branches of government to prevent this kind of slouch toward authoritarianism. And what we have is a deep state, DC swamp rats who are gnawing away at our freedom and crawling out of the administrative state sewer. And that is an attack on our structure of our government and on our individual liberties.
And another thing that concerns me is how academics are helping them along. So you have an enormous amount of grant funding going to universities. I don't know if any are in Missouri. I'd have to double check that. I know Wisconsin's a big one, the University of Wisconsin, where they're hiring academics to actually build out some type of robust censorship model where they could put it in newsrooms to correct any information that's declared misinformation and disinformation. So you have that aspect that's concerning, but you also have academics in the classroom. It doesn't pertain to your case. However, we saw the Supreme Court make the ruling that you can no longer take race into account as far as college admissions go. And unfortunately, you have academics that are in law schools teaching law to these students, constitutional law, saying, well, the president shouldn't listen to the Supreme Court, that the president should do his own interpretation of judicial review and just ignore the Supreme Court. How dangerous is this?
Yeah, it undermines the rule of law. Again, it's a slouch toward authoritarianism. It's the nightmare that our founders sought to prevent by enacting the United States Constitution. Again, that document is in a lot of ways our national identity. It's intended to protect us from the government, and yet here the apparatus of government is being weaponized to attack our fundamental rights. And we're not going to stand for it in Missouri or anywhere else. That's why we fought for a nationwide injunction. And I would point out that the harm is not isolated to the individuals who were deplatformed or removed from big tech or were individually censored. It's the listeners as well, as I pointed out with the Hunter Biden laptop story or with the COVID information. I mean, how many individual personal healthcare decisions were altered because they were deprived of truthful information on big tech social media platforms? That's why the court has found that everyone who has used big tech has in fact been harmed. I would point out that the harm is ongoing, not only because the Department of Justice is committed to future First Amendment violations. That's why they're appealing the case, but also because people are now self-censoring. How many people are scared or reluctant to talk about President Donald Trump or COVID issues on big tech because they're afraid of being kicked off? So the harm is ongoing in 2 different ways. We've got to continue to push this forward. We're not going to let Joe Biden destroy free speech in America.
Yeah, and it's when you talk about people being afraid, I mean, you had the Biden administration release the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism in 2021, where it says that people that express anti-government or anti-authority, not violent extremists, anti-government, anti-authority sentiment, criticism of government, when you question their policies, that they could be a potential domestic violent extremist. And they actually use COVID as an example, people pushing back against COVID narratives. So it really is frightening. Now, I have to ask, has the ACLU, have they contacted you? Have they filed a amicus brief on the case at all to be a friend of the court? Have they said anything?
No, they have not. In the same ways that, they claim to support the Constitution, but only when it fits their radical left-wing ideology. I've never seen the ACLU stand up and fight for our Second Amendment rights either. And certainly they're not going to fight for our First Amendment rights to protect us from free speech when they probably believe in what Joe Biden is doing, which is to suppress any voice in opposition. So no, the ACLU has not been helpful in this context, nor would I anticipate them doing so.
Now, are you surprised by the short-sightedness of the left in this country?
Yes.
And that, at any time power switches hands, that these tactics and tools can be used against them? I mean, I'm against it in all cases. I don't care. I'm a conservative, but I don't want to see progressive voices be silenced. That's the beauty of this country. Are you surprised by their short-sightedness?
I am. And it is a crying shame that the left in this country has abandoned the rule of law that has served this nation so well for more than 200 years. We used to elevate the rules of the game above the players and the outcomes. The left no longer believes in that. They're going to use COVID as the excuse. They think, and Department of Justice, Biden's attorneys argued this in open court. They said that the national emergency justified violations of the Constitution. Well, if that's true, the national emergencies will never end. They'll just conjure up a new national emergency to advocate and advance other constitutional violations in other contexts. So that's a slippery slope. We can't allow that to happen. That's why we have the text, history, and tradition of the Constitution and the freedoms enshrined therein.
And as essentially the chief legal officer of Missouri that's entrusted with protecting Missourians and their rights, where does this case stand now?
Well, we, like I said, we have gained preliminary discovery. We've gotten preliminary discovery. We've only begun to scratch the surface. So we got to continue to root out this vast censorship enterprise. But with the 20,000 documents we have and numerous depositions, we went to court back in May and asked the court to issue a nationwide injunction to start building the wall of separation between tech and state to protect our right to free speech. The judge laid the first brick in that wall on the 4th of July in celebration of this nation's independence by issuing that nationwide injunction. The Department of Justice appealed. They lost at the trial court level. It went up to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. We successfully defeated them twice at the Fifth Circuit. The score is Missouri 3, Biden 0 in the fight for free speech. We're now moving on to the United States Supreme Court. We hope to have this case briefed and argued by the end of the year or early next year. It is imperative that we keep that wall of separation between tech and state in place to protect our right to free speech as we move into that election cycle next year.
And what advice can you give to other attorney generals from other states? I mean, again, we're seeing a massive federal encroachment, and we've been witnessing it for decades, but massive federal encroachment on state sovereignty. You know, they're trying to destroy this concept of federalism that we have. And they used to do it with just grant funding, right? Give the states money and the states have to comply, and all the states want the money because they're addicted to it. Yeah. But now it's almost, it's more abusive than that. It's more overt than that. And they don't even try and hide it anymore.
Yeah, well, Missouri's got 27 lawsuits pending against the Biden administration now. I'm certain we'll have more on file in the coming days and weeks. We're not going to let up for 1 minute in our fight to protect Missourians and our constitutional rights. But two doctrines I would point to that still matter because they involve the text, history, and tradition of the United States Constitution. Number one, it's a separation of powers. Again, the administrative state, there is no sanction for it in the United States Constitution. It is a sewer of DC swamp rats that are gnawing away at our freedom. And we've got to find ways to fight back against unelected bureaucrats who make rules, enforce rules, and then adjudicate disputes. There is no room for that under the separation of powers doctrine in our Constitution. But also, the second one is the anti-commandeering doctrine under the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution stands for the proposition that any authority not explicitly given to the federal government or prohibited to the states is reserved to the states and the people of the states. That means that the federal government can't commandeer the apparatus of state government to accomplish its objectives. Federalism matters. States' autonomy and authority in this federal democratic republic matters. And so the structure is important. We've got to continue to find ways to litigate those issues to protect the structural integrity of our government.
And I think it's so important what you're saying. You're one of the few attorney generals out there that actually have a deep respect for the Constitution and the separation of powers. Why do so many attorney generals throughout the country and over the last 30 years always defer to government power over the people's power or the state's powers?
Yeah, I think that, again, authoritarianism resides at the heart of central control of government. I mean, power is a zero-sum game. The more authority the government has, the less freedom the people have. And that's why the power in the United States is diffused over not only 3 branches of federal government, but shared between federal and state government. So I'm saying the structure matters. What I'm saying is the structure matters to protect our individual liberties and our freedoms. And if you're not focused on protecting those individual liberties and freedoms, I think your priorities are misplaced.
I completely agree with that. Were you as shocked as I was at the reaction of the people when it came down to the coronavirus and how state legislative bodies were being bypassed? But people didn't speak up. They didn't speak out. They didn't question it. There was no debate or anything. It was just that authoritarian approach where you do what we say and that's it. Were you surprised that so many people just not only didn't question it, but actually a lot of them supported it? And listen, I mean, your case is great. And I think it's the most important case in the United States now. But there are a lot of people who actually support the government at censoring other individuals based on misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, number one, I was frightened by how quickly the American public was willing to acquiesce to certain authoritarian tendencies during the COVID pandemic. And I would say that, that really allowed the authoritarians in local, state, and the federal government to expose themselves for what they were. They always had those tendencies. They just didn't have an opportunity to showcase or justify them until there was a perceived national emergency. And I would say that it's during times of perceived national emergency or local emergency that we must be most vigilant in protecting our constitutional rights. That, again, these are timeless principles that are unchanged by the landscape on the ground or the capricious whims of government officials. And so those are when we need to be most scrupulous in our protection of those rights.
Yeah, and what everyone needs to realize is that if this was happening during the Founding Fathers' Day, they would have been censored. They would have been deemed anti-government, anti-authority extremists, and they would have been silenced and censored. That's how important it is. So, Attorney General, what's next for you?
Well, we're going to keep fighting this case. Like I said, we are destined for the United States Supreme Court. If you look at Justice Gorsuch's opinion in Arizona v. Mayorkas that was handed down, I believe, last May, he certainly has telegraphed that this case is coming and that it seems likely that federal officials violated the First Amendment on big tech in a censorship campaign during COVID. Again, my concern here is not just that these were one-off instances of individuals being censored during COVID because of COVID issues. I mean, at some point, this becomes election of interference. We saw it in 2020. We know that the list of issues that the federal government wishes to censor has grown, not shrunk. COVID was the Trojan horse that got the enemy behind the gate, but they're willing to silence any voice in opposition. And so the very freedom, the legacy of individual liberty and freedom that we have inherited in this country is at stake and at risk if we don't stand up and fight back. That's what this lawsuit's all about. We're going to take it to the highest court in the land, and we're looking for other opportunities to protect Missourians and defend our constitutional rights.
And I hope you come back and keep the PAS report audience informed about what's going on with this case, because the work that you're doing is extremely important. Everyone needs to keep up with it. And I urge everyone to give you a follow. Attorney General Andrew Bailey will have the links up on the website for social media, and we'll have the case up as well, PASreport.com. Attorney General, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me on. All the best to you and your listeners.